This is your host, Lisa George. We received a bunch of questions during last month's show that Gary will be answering today. If you do have a question for Gary, please join the live chat on YouTube and put it in all caps, please, so that we can see them. My niece will be in the chat. I think that she's coming in as Lorraine, and so if you see her in there, she'll be helping me again today to retrieve questions so we don't miss any. And thank you so much for all your help for my niece and as well as our awesome moderators. I believe they'll be coming into chat soon. And I'm just looking forward to hearing all these questions answered. Brother Gary, how are you doing? And please share any updates and contact information with our listeners.
Well, so happy to be here again tonight. And so a couple of updates. I don't recall whether or not I talked about book 2 on the audio being released on the last show or not, but it has been released and is doing quite well. And I've also done some upgrades in response to that release on my website, so that now there's a third bundling page for the printed copy. If you want to get signed copies from me, you can get a volume discount, and you can buy on a bundle page and mix the quantities however you want on the third page. So doing a few other updates on the website as we go, and I'm trying to get the links to automatically go over when you're linking over to Amazon.com and to the Kindle and to the audio versions to go to the location of the search, so that I'm hoping to have that up next couple of weeks. So if you're in Australia, if you're in England, you'll click over to Amazon, and it'll bring up the UK page or the AU page or wherever you're located. So I just want to make it easier for people to get the books, whether or not it's the printed copy or the audio or the digital version.
Wow, and I'm still reading your book, Gary. I'm thoroughly enjoying it though, because I continue to read through chapters and then go back like immediately to read it right away, instead of how I did it with your first book, where I read through the whole thing actively. And also it helps too, like when with the notes at the bottom of the page, instead of having to refer to the back section like in your first book. So I really appreciate that. I'm finally on section 7. I haven't started section 7 yet, the fig tree generation. But the last section was just amazing. It brings so much together, even from your first book. Explains it a little more, all these different secret societies and their functions and how they were formed. And I'm so impressed. I've never seen this information put together in this way, and with prophecy included, biblical references. I mean, it's amazing, Gary. I'm so impressed.
Yeah, I'm very happy with the product. And again, what I was trying to do in book 2, not only was I wanting to make it more targeted at Christians and to go deeper into the Bible, but I wanted it to dovetail into book 1, but not that you have to read book 1 to understand book 2 or vice versa, but that it just sort of dovetails in, and you're getting, almost all new information as we go through. And I also wanted to sort of complete some of the things that I was sort of talking about in book 2. So yeah, I wanted to get a little bit more into the secret societies with the Jesuits. I wanted to complete that. It gave everybody how the organizational structures were there to create the Jesuits, and then where they fit into the hierarchy. And I wasn't really ready to go into that in book 1, because so many people have this understanding of the Jesuits being sort of the highest secret society in the world, and they're not. They fit into the organizational structure. So I wanted to make sure I had put out previous information, talked about things, and prepared people to understand what the organizational structure that the occult organizations like to use is, and then how everybody fits in. And so that's all new into book 2 as well, even though you get a lot of that trunk organizational structure that I talk about in book 1 right up to the 13 families. Now I lay out how that works through the thelemic tree. So, and then I wanted to put more in there on prophecy. So you've been reading up to all the information that's important to understand prophecy, and I think you're really going to enjoy section 7, because now it's going to lay down more of the chronology, but probably, as you're reading in section 6, you've got some interesting sections of prophecy that's in there as well. If you're looking at Revelation 9, for example, I give a couple scenarios in there where you have columns of comparison between that and Joel 1 and 2, and for the 200 million man army, and also for the scorpion beings that are coming out of the abyss, as they're described in polytheist religions as the Akraba-Malu.
Yes, yeah, and you did an excellent broadcast on the Black nobility and 13 bloodlines. I think it was called, maybe about a week ago. I think it was Daniel that put it up in the group, and I immediately wanted to listen to it, and it covered the exact chapters I was reading, so it was perfect. I really appreciate that broadcast too, Gary. And for listeners out there, as Gary said before on other shows, he doesn't have a YouTube channel per se, but he does different shows on all different channels. So if you want to find his work, you can type in his name. That's what I do sometimes, and look for the most recent one, or, and all of Gary's work is so valuable. I'd go back years and you can still find amazing information that was new to me anyway. So I really appreciate that, Gary.
Well, I appreciate you saying that as well. And so there's a lot of shows out there over the years. So you put in my name and the subject, and you're probably going to get several ones come up for people to have a look at. So whether it's CERN or you name it, you name the topic, I probably talked about it.
Yeah. And when I was in school, when I was in high school and college, I really was not into history at all. Like I couldn't grasp a lot of it for some reason, but the way you explain it, all of a sudden, yes, I become a history buff, but only in this way as it pertains to the Bible and prophecy. That it makes so much more sense that way.
Well, I did it the other way. I was more of a history and mythology buff before I became a prophecy and biblical buff. So when I was young, I couldn't get my hands on enough books on history in the library. I just devoured it. I just loved it.
Wow. See, I think that my shortcomings were picked up by my daughter because she was a history major in college. And she was always trying to explain all this to me. And I just couldn't get my head wrapped around even why, just the simple thing, why are certain families pushed to power or have this divine right to rule? It didn't make any sense to me. I always had that question in my head, and then you came out and answered it right away. And then also linking it with like the famous ones of today, or similar to like the famous ones of old, right?
Well, and one of the things I would ask when after I published book 1, when I was doing a show, and I'm making these connections that other people haven't really made, particularly with the bloodlines and the genealogies that the Royals take back to giants and to their, as I like to say, tongue-in-cheek celestial mafia godfathers. And so I would ask a question to the host when they're saying, well, I'm not sure, I'm ready to sort of buy into this. I would say, well, what makes a royale? What gives them the divine right to rule?
Yes.
They would say, nobody's ever asked me that question. I've never thought about it that way. What does give them the right, and what is a royale? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And then I've been making some connections. I'm sure people on the page in Facebook, as well as your page, I put some of my theories up there about, after we had this conversation in the last show, about how, the royals, they love to be famous, they love to be seen, they own all the media, so why would they not play like the major roles in the media, the famous names, in other words. And I especially was caught, just a couple minutes here, I was caught at the end of your chapter called The Dragon Kingdom of Heaven. That was an amazing and eye-opening chapter to me, because I knew about the King of Jerusalem title going to Godfrey de Bouillon, of course, as the first one. And then you explained it so well of how all that worked and how the rituals and where the rituals were, the base of Mount Hermon, the Praia of Sion, like it ties all that in together. And so I was thinking, oh, wait, now who is the King of Jerusalem today? And there you list right there, King Philippe the sixth, I believe it is, who now holds the title. And so I immediately had to go and see what this person looked like. And I immediately tied it to certain actors. And I don't want to take up that time here, but I just had these theories. I kept thinking in my head, if these royals are like as ego driven as it seems like they would be, and if they own the media, why would they not be acting as the lead roles in all these movies?
Well, yeah, and I'm not saying that they are the royales, but if you are that powerful and if you are that wealthy, why wouldn't you sponsor actors, with your power who look like you to sort of be your public sort of face, like to be your mask, and then try and line up roles for them that you would like to have for them. I know that's a bit of a interesting sort of concept that you put out there, but it's nonetheless a very interesting idea. And I've talked about on other shows in terms of the theater and the history and the masks that they used to wear, because the actor and actress would be channeling a demonic spirit and playing these heroes of old. I mean, all of the entertainment was about the royales. It was about their belief systems and their genealogy. So they would wear this mask. Sometimes it was a plain white mask. Sometimes, as in places like China, it was a little bit more overt, where you have the white in the back, but you have these demonic faces on it. But it's not the individual that you're supposed to be understanding with that sort of concept. It's who you're channeling. It's like the shamans who wear that white face. They're channeling that. That's why they change their face to white, just as the mimes are channeling. The court jesters are doing the same kinds of things. And so there's a relationship there. I'm not sure I fully understand all of it as to how they interact with the theater group, but they sponsored throughout history this kind of literature and this kind of entertainment to promote their culture and their belief systems. So I think they have an intimate relationship there. I'm just not sure all the connections, and your connection is certainly an interesting one, and it would play into their hubris. Why not, if you can get somebody who has your facial traits or the facial traits of your bloodline to be in the movies and personifying that bloodline in as many movies as they can, whether in a physical way or an allegorical way.
Yes, you said that so well. And I couldn't have said it better, Gary, but it looks like we have some questions here to go over. The first several, as you notice, were from our mutual friend, Daniel Sullivan. So if you're ready, Gary, we can go ahead and start with those. His questions are always extremely interesting and involved. So are you ready?
I am.
Okay, let's do the first question from Daniel Sullivan. I believe he's in the chat. How you doing, brother? His first question is Romans 11 a second Exodus scripture? When will the deliverer come out of Zion to turn away the ungodliness from Jacob?
Yeah, there's some very good questions there. And Romans 11 is going to play a fairly important role for me in book 3 that I'm writing. And I think that we need to get a better understanding of the Old Testament, and that the New Testament is just sort of the fulfillment of what's being talked about in the Old Testament. And they're going to be talking about the same things. Now, you have a church that's being grafted in, that's being talked about in Romans 11, but that nonetheless does not dismiss the covenant that was made with Israel that God remembers forever in the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So this is an interesting passage that should unite Christians with the importance of the covenant of the Israelites that we've been grafted into, and that this is indeed, I think, a passage that is a New Testament definition for what we might anticipate and dig into more in the New Testament. So it is very interesting in some of the words that are in there in Romans 11, where it has, you know, it's talking to us about that. Paul is talking to us as a Jewish individual, that he doesn't want us to be ignorant of this mystery. And this mystery, it's using one of those marker words that when it's involved in a prophetic sense is when the mystery of God is fulfilled in the days of the seventh trumpet. And this is connecting it in as an extension out of that as part of the reconciliation that Paul is talking about for Israel in Romans 11. And so that reconciliation is part of the second Exodus. And so, Paul, is discussing about this concept of an election of grace and the remnant. And the remnant is Judah, and it's the lost tribes who are going to be awakened in the end time. But temporarily, Israel, who is lost, and Judah, who we can visibly see some of the people coming out of the southern kingdom today, many who are in the covenant land today, but there's people all over the world, they've been blinded. And they stumbled in a way that violated the Holy Covenant several times, including the last time, which was rejecting their Messiah. And so they stumbled so that salvation could come to the church, to the Gentiles. And that was a fulfillment through the curses of the covenant, of the Holy Covenant, versus the blessings of the covenant. And after that salvation has come to the Gentiles, then the restoration of Israel will proceed. So it's even giving us an order to how this works out. And so in Romans 11:25, all Israel will be saved when the deliverer comes out of Zion because of this holy covenant. It's all part of that whole mix. And so Paul is referring to he's referring to the book of Isaiah, when the Redeemer comes out of Zion in Isaiah 59:20. And then you get into chapter 60, 61, and 62, which is all about second Exodus. And there are just so many passages and chapters in the Old Testament on second Exodus. I mean, it should be completely well known, but it's not. And so that's why, I'm going to be doing book 2 to make those prophetic and historical sort of connections. And what's interesting in Isaiah 59:20 is there's going to be a standard that's raised in the time of the deliverance of Israel. And we understand in the New Testament the sign of Jesus, but in the Old Testament, it's called the ensign. It's called the standard, and it's called the banner, and they are prophecy markers for the time. And a lot of times they'll be included in passages that will talk about the Gentiles, that Paul is talking about, that Judah stumbles so salvation can come to the Gentiles and be grafted into this covenant, into the olive tree. It's another terrific allegory, but it takes a lot to go in and talk about that, because you could almost, the olive tree, make that a book in itself. So, but when we when we look at the second Exodus that is being referenced here with the restoration of Israel, I mean, you get into Isaiah chapter 11, where a branch comes out of Jesse, and this is going to be an ensign to the people and the Gentiles.
Right.
And then second Exodus starts. Okay, so as we sort of fit that in, we're going to understand that Jesus is coming back for a rapture, and then he's coming back for second Exodus, and then he's coming back for Armageddon, or he's staying for all of those days. But it's one of the two, because in Hosea 9:7, we're getting the days of Jehovah of the Elohim's visitations.
Wow.
And in Luke 17, 21 and 26, or 22 and 26, you have a parallel passage that is talking about the days as in plural, and it's not a mistranslation, as in the days of the Son of Man. And so this is in the period also where his sign comes out after the abomination. This is the great tribulation of the last 3.5 years. And that's the Greek word thlipsis, which means affliction, as it's used in Matthew 24:9 for the affliction or the tribulation of the saints. Mark 13:19, when it's talking about the great tribulation, it doesn't say great tribulation, it just says affliction, but the rest of the description is the same and in the same order right after the abomination. So it's a parallel passage for Matthew 24:21, but it says affliction there. So the translations aren't always as consistent as they ought to be, but that parallels with Ezekiel 30, make that Jeremiah 37. That's part 30, verse 7, and chapters 30 and 31 are all about second Exodus. And 37 is a very famous passage where it says this is the time of Jacob's trouble that they will be saved out of. And in the context of those 2 chapters of the Exodus, they are going to be saved from the wrath of God, just as the church is being saved from the wrath of God just afterwards, and going through basically a tribulation of fire in the last 3.5 years. And Micah 5:2 is talking about, in 5:5, I like to match that up because they're talking about second Exodus in the time of the Assyrian and the 7 shepherds. Or Micah 2, or that's 5:2, I'm sorry. And also in 5:5 that extends into. And then in Micah 2, we get information about the gathering of the remnant of the Israel by the breaker, which is the Messiah Jesus, which is the deliverer from Zion, and who is our Redeemer. And that breaker is going to do this in the year of the Lord's favor that Luke talks about. That is talking about second Exodus, and when he frees the people from the prisons in Isaiah 62. Right. And so Isaiah 49, just I won't be too much longer on this, but just to sort of put down a premise here for people. Isaiah 49, there's a standard that's lifted to the Gentiles and to Israel as the gathering starts to begin in the Exodus. So again, we need to be aware of the terms for the sign of Jesus that is going to, as in Revelation 1, is going to show him as being the one that's pierced, that after the sign, after the abomination, after Judah flees from Jerusalem, they're going to mourn for the one that they pierced. They're going to be reconciled. And I think the 144,000 will awaken I should say not awakening, but will awaken the lost tribes of Israel, who are going to be put into prisons around the world that they're going to be broken out of, and they're going to be reconciled. And as you get into Ezekiel 37, you get the resurrection and the judgment of Israel and the joining of the 2 sticks in preparation for the supper and the millennium. And Daniel 12:1 is talking about their resurrection, which is a separate resurrection than the resurrection sequence given to us in the New Testament for the saints. This happens when Michael stands sometime after the midpoint of the last 7 years and into that period of Jacob's trouble, and some will be raised to and judged to everlasting life, and some will be to death. And again, as you move on in Ezekiel 37, you get the second Exodus. So we get the timing of that as it's all sort of coming together. And that's the time of trouble, which is, again, Jacob's trouble is Hebrew sarah, meaning the same things as affliction, persecution, and tribulation. You have that same word that's used in Daniel 12:1 for that trouble. And in Isaiah 62, he gathers them from the ends of the earth.
Mm.
And in Isaiah 61, we get the year of the Lord's favor, just as we get that in Luke 4. And for people who want to look at the promise that comes out of the curses of the covenants, the easiest verse to put it together in it is Deuteronomy 34-5, where it talks about through the curses of the covenants, even though they violated the covenant, he's going to remember their covenant and he's going to gather them back. And in some other passages in the Bible, it's going to say calling them back by name. So this is indeed a linkage passage for us to get into all of this other detail and information and learn how that fits into the chronology that Jesus provides us in Matthew 24. And so when does the deliverer come out of Zion to turn away the ungodliness from Jacob? Well, he comes back in the days of his visitation. He comes back for rapture after the first fruits have been resurrected. And he comes back to take the people who are still alive and those who died in Christ but weren't martyrs. Then after that, you will get the deliverer that's going to be as described as coming out of Zion in the Old Testament. So the timing is just absolutely in perfection if you let it come together. So yeah, it's a very interesting passage. There are other ones that connects back, but that to me is the one that I think that Christians should become very, very familiar with. And I know it's a hard pill to swallow depending on what sort of doctrines people have been taught, but Romans 11 makes it perfectly clear. God has not forgotten his people, and he will remember his covenant, and he will reconcile them. And there's a year of reconciliation and redemption, and it all fits in with how the days and the years are laid out and how they match up with those cross-referencing years in the New Testament that we're not going to get as much information on because the church, I think, is not here in the last 3.5 years. They are up to the midpoint of the last 7 years, but not during that great tribulation, because we're going to be saved from the hour of trial and from the year of the Lord's wrath. So within that 3.5 year picture, you basically have 2 years taken up with the year of the Lord's wrath and the year of the Lord's favor. So you start to see that squeezing down as to when that second Exodus is likely to come.
Oh, excellent, Gary. And the way that you say the days of Messiah is before and after the tribulation, it's similar to like when you look at the days of Noah, right? Before and after the flood, days of Noah. So it's always great to refer back to scripture so we know what to expect. And the way you explain it is so awesome. Thank you, Gary. Second question from Daniel Sullivan. What is the timeline of the 2300 days of transgression of desolation when the sanctuary and hosts are trampled underfoot? Is it divided between reigns of Babylon and Antichrist?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and I'll do the best I can with it, but it is a mystery. And, for me, as a contrarian, I like to be able to verify things. And this 2,300 days doesn't fit, no matter how I do it. But I liked how Daniel posed within his question there, does it roll back into the reign of Babylon? And it's an interesting question. I think not, but it's one of those two ways. If you want to reconcile the numbers that I'll get into in a second, you might reconcile it. I think it has some other issues and I'm not saying Daniel is saying that's when it goes to. I'm just saying you start to get into some issues. So basically, we have 7 years of 30-day months in Daniel 9:27 is set down for the last 7 years. We have those 7 years played out in splitting it up in different terms in the book of Revelation, where you have, the 3.5 years before Antichrist is crowned in Revelation 13, and he rules for 3.5 years afterwards. And during the first 3.5 years, part of the first fruits who are going to be martyred including the 144,000, and other church saints who are going to die for their testimony of Jesus, but you're going to have the two witnesses prophesy for 3.5 years, as Revelation 11 tells us. So we have those constants of the 3.5, and 7 years. And in the chronology that Jesus provides us, and one of the things I just sort of like to underline is that people say you can't put Revelation onto what Jesus said. Well, I disagree with that, and here's why. Because it says in chapter 1, this is the testimony of Jesus Christ that was given to the angel to show John in vision. So it has to fit. He's not going to contradict himself. So you have to be able to overlay it onto his template. And you put everything around what Jesus said. And he gave us the chronology while he was still here. And so the additional information is going to fit if you let it. But so many approaches don't want to sort of look at it that way. And I respect that. But again, I'm a contrarian. I like things to match up, which is why this 2,300 days is really kind of important. But what Jesus did do in his chronology in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21 is he put the abomination at the time of the midpoint of the last 7 years. And then Luke puts the armies of the Antichrist surrounding Jerusalem, just as Daniel 11 does, in the details up to the abomination. And when you see that, your redemption draws nigh, which is, again, talking about rapture for the church. And one would think that that would also have an inference to the second Exodus that will be coming for Israel and Judah as well. So you have this convergence of this time frame of 7 years at 30 days, and that doesn't add up to 2,300 days. So you would, right? So you would have 1,290 times 2, which would be 2,580 days. So now you have 280 days that the 2,300 days doesn't cover. There's a gap there. And so when I look at now, when I go into like Daniel 12, and we get some more numbers, you get after the abomination, there is going to be 1,290 days, which is, you would expect that because of the other information that's saying that it's 3.5 years. But then it says in Daniel 12 is that waiting to 1,335 days is another date that we should keep in mind. And that's interesting because it's referring to blessed is he that waits and comes to basically the temple or the sanctuary at 1,335 days. So there's a gap there of another 45 days.
Oh,
and
yes,
you're going, right? So, but it doesn't line up with the 2,300 days either.
Yeah. Oh, it's so frustrating.
So it is frustrating. So you're trying to figure out what is being talked about is really, really important. At least for me. I mean, I have faith, but I like things to make sense, and I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction. I don't believe that it makes mathematical errors. It just doesn't seem plausible to me.
Yeah.
So when you look at now what Daniel 8:14 is talking about in there's some important information where that I think is connecting into Daniel 12, and it's talking about, I'll just read the passage. It says, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So there's going to be a cleansing that's part of those days that are in there. And I think that's what's happening after the abomination, and why you have this additional 35 days or so in Daniel 12, that people are going to probably have to wait until that sanctuary, the temple, is cleansed. Whatever that cleansing is going to be, that's what they're setting aside to do it. So the 2300 days doesn't really go into the rest of the prophecy where it has the Greek and the Persian kings in the beginning, because we're getting that information as part of the length of the vision, and the linkage to the cleansing goes back to 8:9 through 8:12, where you have the transgression and the trampling that's happening on the sanctuary. And just as in Revelation 11, you're going to get 3.5 years of Jerusalem being trampled by the Gentiles. So the same period, right? It's adding up. But again, that only comes to 1,290 days. So and so now you can't move that 2,300 days past the 3.5 year point, and then another, say 1,000 days rough and dirty, because we're limited based on what Daniel 12 talks about. So there's some conundrums here, right?
Yeah.
So, and for years, I looked at, it's got to fit. You got to be able, we're getting way too many numbers and they have to fit. So it's interesting how that Daniel 8:14 is translated, which is also a mystery to me, because when I look at, and I use Bible Hub and any other Bible I can get a find on when I get a chance, is I'm looking for a translation that might be different than the number that's in Daniel 8:14, but they all say 2,300 days. But the mystery about that is that I don't know how they come up with that number. Because when you take it back to the Hebrew, you've got a number that has been inserted, and it says, where it says 2,000, 1,000's a word, 2, and unto before that, and unto me before that, has been inserted by the translators to make sense out of the passage. So 2 is inserted.
Oh, wow.
And so now if you go into the meaning of 1,000, and understanding 2 is inserted, it's the Hebrew word aleph, and it actually means 1,000. Now, a lot of times in Hebrew, you're going to get a word like arba that is ordinal for numbers similar to it, like 40. So you could translate it as 4 or 40, but we don't get any of that in terms of 1,000. It's just 1,000, and that's based on a company of troops of 1,000. So it's a kind of firm number, and yet we have this 2 that's put in there. And so when I look at that, I look at the word days, and it has 2 sources for the word days in there. So yes, I've looked at this, and I look at it in ways that maybe other people don't. But so you've got Arab, which is one of the words, and the other one is Boker. So Arab means basically an evening and a night. An evening and a morning. So an evening, night, and a morning, right? So it can mean both. And then Boker means basically morning or sunrise. So it's either going to be 1,000. If you leave the 2 out of it, you're going to get 1,000 evening and nights. Or if you want to multiply that by 2, you're going to get 2,000 there. And then you've got the number of 300 days. So maybe that's how they get there. But basically, it doesn't say that it is, 2,000. It doesn't say in the passage 1,000 evenings plus 1,000 mornings to get to that 2,000. I think I think it should be 1,000. And
That
So
seems more accurate to me too, the way you're
and they only
describing it.
doubled the 1,000. They didn't double the 300 days. So
Right, right.
so
That's
it's kind of out of whack. And I think they might have used that based on Daniel 12 on how they got there, just so that I wanted to know like how or why would they get there. And again, when you get into the numbers there, when it says in Daniel 11, it says 1,290 days. The two's been inserted, but I can see a biblical reference to put that in because you have other numbers that would suggest that that would be the right interpretation. You know, as being 3.5 years at 30 months. It makes sense. And so maybe they used that and rolled it back for the translation in Daniel 8. But I can't say for sure, and I can't find any information as to why it's been translated this way. But if you look at it from how it's literally stated in Hebrew, you're going to get, 1,300 days.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that starts to make a little bit more sense. So that you're going to be getting the sanctuary cleansed within 1,300 days of the transgression of the abomination. So that is going to give us a little bit better number to work with. And so you have 3.5 years at 1,290 days. So you've got an extra 10 days there that falls within that gap for how long the people of Judah are being instructed to stay, effectively stay away and be blessed after that into the temple. So it falls very, very much within that time frame of those numbers. And so now that starts to make some sense, because if it's 10 days, maybe it's only 20 days that they're doing for the cleansing of the temple and the sanctuary in January 12th, and it starts to make some sense. But it's still, make that 25 days to do the math properly on that versus the 20. But it's in the zone. It fits within the dates. So that's my best explanation so far, and I'm looking for more, and it's not something that you would really want to hang your total hat on, but I think it makes more sense than trying to figure out this 2,300 days, because I looked at that for over a decade and I couldn't make any sense using that number.
Wow, yeah, when you explain it like that, it does make sense that would be like a discrepancy, a scribal insert or something, because we see these throughout the Bible, and you've done your due diligence for a decade, Gary, so I think that makes a lot more sense to me too.
Yeah, I think it's a translation error out of and plugging it to try and make some sense, and so I think they obviously struggled with that as well in the translations. So.
Yeah, maybe they spent several decades trying to decide what that number's in there, and then it's not correct. So yeah, how you just explained that was extremely well, Gary. Thank you. Let's go on to the next question, if you're ready for this. Again, from Daniel Sullivan as well. In the book of Jeremiah, who is visiting in the year of visitation? Will Jesus be here for a year to harvest the grapes, tread winepress alone, and pour out bowls of wrath with 7 angels?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, and this term visitation, and I used it in the last question, or in the first question, when we were talking about the days of Jehovah's visitations, and so when you get into the book of Jeremiah, now you're dealing with all of these prophecies in around the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and we're getting the same term in visitations that's being used. And what's interesting is in terms of Jeremiah 4. And I never used to use this passage for as a dual prophecy. And the reason why I was just struggling with some of the details in terms of what my parameters were for a dual prophecy. And what I call a dual prophecy is it's a prophecy that gives important prehistory. That's important to understand what's happened as an extension out of that, and for understanding our world today and for the end time. And also, it's prophecy for the time of the prophet. And then there's prophecies that aren't fulfilled in that prophecy of Jeremiah. I mean, in that prophecy of the time of the prophet. And the prehistory information doesn't really fit properly as well, typically. So Jeremiah 4, I now look into that as that kind of prophecy. And it's very much akin to Isaiah 14, where we get this rebellion that Satan did in trying to raise his throne into heaven. And we also get the king of Babylon and Assyria, and it's relevant for the prophecies that Isaiah is doing for Israel at that time. But then we have this Assyrian being killed on the mountain, and some other details that sort of go with it that aren't fulfilled. Ezekiel 28 has Tyrus and those same types of things going on, and there's lots of these dual prophecies. Well, not lots, but there's a number of them that deal with this, including Jeremiah 51, so which is the destruction of Babylon. So in Jeremiah 4, verse 5, it says that to declare in Judah and publish in Jerusalem, say, blow the trumpet. And a trumpet, if it's used in prophecy or for an end time prophecy, is a distinct time marker from the Old Testament. So you want to be careful not to confuse a prophecy for the time of the prophet for an end time prophecy if there's a trumpet that's being blown, or if there's a passage in the Old Testament for a trumpet, but it can be. So, and a trumpet, of course, reminds us of the 7 trumpets in the time of the rapture and stuff. So,
right. It
also has in Jeremiah 4:6 that the standard will be set up towards Zion. And but it's also, with that standard, it's also talking about evil coming from the north and a great destruction. So again, you could look at that, that could be Nebuchadnezzar, or it could have some implication on the end time. But one of the things that isn't composite with the prophecies is when you get into Jeremiah 4:21, it's talking about the standard again and the sound of the trumpet. And then Jeremiah beholds the earth, and it was without form and void in the heavens, and showed no light. And again, that's a reference to the end time, but it's also a reference possibly between Genesis 1:1 and 2, and form and void, is used as being the earth was form without form and void, although you could translate that as was. So it could go back to what happened in prehistory in an angelic rebellion. And then you have the sound of the trumpet and the standard being used. So I now look at this as being a dual prophecy. So if we understand that, and we understand the standards and the trumpet part of it, which is why I spent a little bit of time on that, when we look at Jeremiah, you get this word visitation that's used a lot throughout the book of Jeremiah in the prophecies. And so, and just as again, we talked about Hosea 9:7, the days of recompense. So again, when you're sorting through that, we have to sort of look at the difference between what's going on as a punishment to the violation of the covenant at that time, because they're going to be taken into Babylon, into exile, Judah will be, to what might be details that aren't there for that particular time. And so when we look at and its relationship also to Babylon and other prophecies on that. So in Jeremiah 5:9, we're going to get passages where we're going to have Jehovah or Jehovah of the Elohim, which is the Word of God, which is Jesus, as he's described in the Old Testament, from my understanding. Mm-hmm. And there's an appointment of the Feast of the Harvest, and the harvest is an end time allegory as well. And it's also part of the appointed feasts, which are also prophetic in nature. And the harvest is the end time, right? So you're getting some of these words that are being used. And in 6:7, it's talking about the Lord of hosts, and Jerusalem is visited by the Lord of hosts. And you're getting more visitations in Jeremiah 8 and Jeremiah 9 and 10 and 14 and 15 and 46 and more. I mean, just so many of them. But when you get into Jeremiah 27, 22, that's when you start to get some connections with the word visitation and the gathering from Babylon to restore Israel. So now we're talking about not only what would happen in the time of the prophet, but this is the same timing with the destruction of Babylon. And everybody's told to come out of Babylon before its destruction in the end time at the beginning of the last 3.5 years, which is the timing of the Great Tribulation and Jacob's trouble that we talked about earlier. And then in Jeremiah 51, you're getting that 50 and 51, you're getting visitations as well, and you're getting the destruction that lines up with the destruction of Babylon in the end time, with the details that don't exactly match with the history of what happens to Babylon with the Medes taking over. It's so when I look at the visitations that are in there, then I think we have to take some of those visitations, use them in context, understand this is the Lord, this is Jehovah of the Elohim, this is Jesus in his days of visitation, or the days of the Son of Man. And in Jeremiah 23:12, this is the year of the gathering of the remnant in his visitation. I mean, you can't get any more sort of obvious than that. And
very specific.
And sets shepherds, just as Micah talks about the appointment of 7 shepherds. So I'm not saying all of those visitations are end time visitations. I'm just trying to use the ones that I would be comfortable in saying those are ones that are going to be fulfilled in the end time. But that is, I think the question is, who is this person visiting? That's Jesus. And so Jesus is going to be here a year to harvest the grapes and tread the winepress that he's talking about, and pour out the wrath bowls. That's the year of the Lord's wrath. And we also have the year of the Lord's favor and the redemption and the reconciliation. But there's also the year of the recompense for Israel as well, for the harm that's been done to them. So yeah, I think that's very much tied in, and we can glean carefully that information out.
Oh, thank you for that, Gary. I was also going to comment on your chapter, the Thelemic tree. I really enjoyed that. And as we're talking about Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, Jeremiah 4, as you related that, but especially the Isaiah passage, because I've heard other researchers and pastors and evangelical theologians or whoever try to explain exactly what was going on with all those trees and the branches and why was the Assyrian in the garden. I mean, like, when there was no Assyria yet at that time. It made no sense to me, but the way you explained it was awesome. We are at break, everybody, so go grab something to drink, something to eat, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
When Justin and I found out we were having a little girl, we named her Eliana and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing. So we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work and praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. With our newest addition to the family, Ezra, we also added Enoch's Judgment of the Giants to this prophecy series. We're excited to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out sacredwordpublishing.com/collections/children's-store.
Mountain High Time, 2 hours of an organization to the madness, discussing the ever-changing dynamics of being both physically and mentally prepared for a plethora of possible outcomes to our future and present. A look into the latest technologies, new scientific discoveries, and how they might be used in connection to the human domain and controlling it, ancient cultures and places. Be warned. This is an opinionated look through headlines, guests that are not afraid to question the narrative, a little bit of crazy ramblings of a stoner conspiracy factus that pushes constitutional concepts. The place and the time are the same, another dimension we call Mountain High Time. Saturdays 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Mountain High Time, right here on Revolution.radio, where information never sleeps and truth breaks the spell.
Check in every Thursday night for the Crypt Rick and Jonathan Show.
Studio A, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here at the #1 listener-supported radio station, Revolution Radio.
I want to thank everybody for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the one place where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio.
All right, let's show them what we got.
All right, thanks for listening while we take that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
Hello and welcome back. We're back here from break with author, researcher, and public speaker Gary Wayne. He's been answering some questions here with Ask Me Anything session for the first month. It was the first Ask Me Anything session for the year 2025. I was going to tell you Happy New Year to everyone. Happy Gregorian New Year, I guess I should say. And yes, if you have questions for Gary that you would like him to ask in our next Ask Me Anything, please put them in all capital letters in the YouTube chat. And my niece, Rihanna, will, I keep saying Lorraine, but it's Rihanna. She switched her name again in the chat. She will be taking them down and she'll get them to us for the next AMA. Brother Gary, are you there? And are you ready for some more questions? I think your mic might be off, Gary, if you want to switch that on there.
Yeah, all set to go.
Okay, there we go. All right. First I wanted to ask you, have you been feeling okay, Gary? There's been so many reports and everything on social media. I don't know if you've seen the thing with the weird fog happening all over the world, and then people getting sick, and something with these drones. I didn't see any of that here in Hawaii. We didn't have those issues, but there's quite a few people who've been affected by that.
Yeah, I've been hearing about that. I've not experienced any of it, so not sure what to make of all of that. And I'm doing good.
Okay.
So no complaints.
That's good to hear. And if anybody listening or that it's in the chat, if you have prayer requests, if you haven't been feeling well, I think there's a couple people in there that I am taking the prayer requests down, and we do have a prayer meeting every Saturday where we pray for everyone. So if you're affected by that and you would like prayers, please go ahead and put that in the chat, and we will address that. But we are going back to our next question from our friend again, who asked these amazing questions, Daniel Sullivan. He's got another question about prophecy, and this one addresses the kings of the beast nations. His question is, were the kings of the 6 beast nations of the Bible all Rephaim giants? How tall were the pharaohs, Nebuchadnezzar, Alexandra, etc.? Gary.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it varies to a certain degree on sizes as you come down through history, and there's more intermarriage with humans, so they're going to lose a lot of their attributes, including their size. But the opening premise for the question for me to answer is yes, these would be giants and descendants of giants, just as the royals are the kings of God and receive the divine right to rule from the council of the gods. They're all going to be kings, and these are beast empires. These are spiritual beasts, just as the New Testament describes them as ones who slander heavenly beings, including God, just as Antichrist would do, and just as I think it's in the book of Yashar that Nimrod slandered God as an Antichrist figure, if that's accurate in the book of Yashar. So these spiritual beasts is really part of the answer for who these giants are, because their disembodied spirits are the immortal spirits that were passed on by their angelic fathers. And so when we look at a couple examples of this, I'm going to reference Ezekiel 32. And Ezekiel 32, you have an interesting group of people called the terrible ones that are speaking to Pharaoh, another terrible one. And this
and then a title of one of your chapters that I really enjoyed as well.
Yeah. And sort of what's kind of important about this term for the terrible ones, that's also who's included in the terrible ones is the one Nebuchadnezzar, who comes out of Babylon, that Ezekiel 32 is talking about. And he's called the terrible one, and he's called the terrible of nations is his exact title. And so when we look at who's in the pit prison, these are the disembodied spirits of the mighty, which is Gibborim in Ezekiel 32:21 and elsewhere in Ezekiel 32. And along with them, and these ones are talking from the sides of the pit, and there's also another group called the strong that are in the pit prison there as well, talking to Pharaoh, and that's the Hebrew word El. Now you could translate that as strong and not necessarily be wrong, but it says, the strong among the mighty. So they're talking about two different peoples here, and that's the Hebrew word El for an angel or a god. So probably the fallen angels that are also speaking to Pharaoh somehow in this very interesting sort of dual prophecy. And these are mighty ones, and these are giants. And Egypt is one of the beast kingdoms. The Pharaoh this time isn't, but he's a descendant of those beast kingdoms, of the first one, as
Right.
we would understand the 7 kingdoms coming in relationship to Daniel 7 versus Daniel 8. They're both accurate, come up with the same number, provide additional information with different allegories. And so another one that is listed as part of the 7, as most people would understand it from the beast empires, is Assyria. That again, were not provided in Daniel 7, but Asher is provided here in Ezekiel 32:22, who is in the pit prison. And so again, we're getting a connection here between giants, their dynastic runs, and their kings and emperors of these empires. And you've got Meshech in there as well. And so you also have another interesting one called Elam or Olam, of ancient and old. And I talk about the Olamim as people, as part of the people of Shem, are going to intermarry with, and even, as we get more historical information, they're showing a merger of 2 different peoples. And Olam or Elam would be the patriarch of those Eastern giants, one of the sort of groups that are there. And so again, you have within Mesopotamia, you're getting the Assyrians, you're getting the Babylonians, you're getting the Medes and Persia. And the Medes and Persia, not the Medes, the Persians in Persia, the first kings, these are the Achaemenid kings. And they take their genealogies back took their genealogies back to the Aryans, which are the giants, we would call from a biblical perspective. So again, there's just connection after connection to giants here. And whether it's true or not, the mythos behind Alexander is that the mother is Olympia, but the father is a moon and a serpent.
Wow.
Yeah, and I put that into book 1. I give that whole account. So again, they're creating at least a genealogical mythos directly to a second incursion giant, right? So we're not told Alexander is a giant, but he's one of the greatest warriors, of all time as a general. And so it's just so rich in its kind of imagery. And this word terrible one. If it wasn't plural, it would be arit, which is the original Hebrew word, just as Rapha is the singular form of Raphaim or Nephilim. And so Nephil and Rapha are understood as giant ones in the plural,